and I.
Welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining us this evening. My name is Julie Vendors. I'm the Adult Programming Coordinator at Otis Library in downtown Norwich. And thank you for joining us this evening for the program Perfecting Humanity, the Norwich State Hospital, and the Science of Racial Purity. This program will be presented by Robert Farwell. Bob is the Executive Director of Otis Library. And just a little housekeeping this evening. I'd like everyone to please mute your microphones if you could. That would be very helpful. If you have any questions this evening as the program is going along, feel free to put them in the chat, or you can save them for the end. But there will be time at the end for some Q&A, but we're just going to ask that you please save that for the end. But we do say, I always tell people, put them in the chat so that you don't forget them also, because we can read them through at the end of the program. So I'm so glad you're here with us this evening. And I am going to hand it over to Robert Farwell. This is actually, I believe, correct me if I'm wrong, Bob, but I believe this is the third time you've presented this program.
Yeah, I think that's right.
Yeah, it's the first time you've done it virtually, but he did present this program. The very first time it was presented, it was when we had an exhibit at the Otis Library, a traveling exhibit from the Smithsonian Institute in Washington, D.C. And the program was exploring human origins and what does it mean to be human. And this program actually was such a good fit, and it was so well received that we do every few years, we do have Bob bring it back. And I'm so glad that he's willing to do it each time I ask. It always gets a new audience and a lot of people talking. So it is an important subject. So thank you for doing this for us, Bob. And I'm going to go ahead and mute my microphone right now.
Well, as Mrs. Farwell says, I've never met an audience I didn't like. So I'm more than happy to do it. Let me give you a little bit of background on why I became interested in this particular topic. It has a couple of antecedents, and the first is in the course of doing some research work on prior to the exhibit that Julie described to you. I happened on a short paper that mentioned the biological laboratory at Cold Spring Harbor, New York. And in another life, as a museum director, that was my first directorship was at the Whaling Museum in Cold Spring Harbor. But Cold Spring Harbor is also very well known for its biological laboratory, which is internationally famous. Amongst there are a number of Nobel Prize winners on the staff there, including James Watson, who, he is a prior director, and some of you may recall that he and Francis Crick were credited with the discovery and articulation of the DNA helix. As I got into this research, I discovered that one of the founders of the Whaling Museum had also been the first director of the biological lab, and had been the founding director of what was known as the Eugenics Record Office. His name was Charles Benedict Davenport, and his connection was, like the biological laboratories, international in scope. He corresponded with like-minded individuals all over the world, but primarily in Europe. And his speciality and his focus was what we would I think in layman's terms call racial purity, promoting racial hygiene, but with a particular emphasis on mastering genetics to the point where we could actually predict what future generations would be like, and in a sort of darker corollary to that, how we would eliminate those whose qualities were not acceptable, people with disabilities, people with particular traits. So we'll meet Mr. Davenport, Dr. Davenport, pardon me, as we go through these slides. He died long before I became director at the Cold Spring Harbor Whaling Museum, but I did know his daughter. His daughter was in her 80s at that time. And I will give you a description of Dr. Davenport as we go along. I will only say at this point that the apple did not fall far from the tree. She was quite an interesting personality in her own right. I would hazard to say that opinionated is probably a kind description of Jane Davenport de Tomasi. So let's get started. Talk a little bit about the hospital itself. This is a view of the state hospital. It opened in 1904. This is a pretty good indication of what it would have looked like at that time. This is roughly contemporary with the opening. As you can see from some of the text on the slide, in 1929, it had patient population over 2,000. What's equally noteworthy is that this was the first location for most of the eugenics projects and sterilizations that would take place in the state of Connecticut. It had a number of facets to its history, a lot of them having to do with practices that I think we in the 21st century would find abhorrent. I don't want to stray too far from the topic of eugenics, but I think it's worth noting that eugenics was not the only questionable practice that the hospital was engaged in. What you see here is an illustration from the United States Army Medical Archives. And this is human experimentation being performed at the biological lab during the Second World War. As you know, during the Second World War, there were a number of groups who, because of their religious practices, were exempt from military service. Probably, arguably the best known would be the Society of Friends, more commonly known as the Quakers. But there were several other sects that fell into the category of peace churches, and they were used for alternative service, and one of those services was as human guinea pigs for various types of experimentation that would be of particular use to the military. In the case of the the case that you see here, Dr. Havens, who was the director of this program, is infecting a patient with a form of infectious hepatitis. There were a number of these experiments that were conducted during the Second World War at the hospital. There were other photographs that show the same thing happening. Havens continued these experiments long after he left the military, and actually at the time of his death in the 1980s, he was given verbal laurels for his work on infectious hepatitis. This was a highly contagious disease. There were thousands of members of the US military, particularly those stationed in North Africa, who succumbed to this. So these experiments were part of a larger program to determine the cause, to identify different strains, and hopefully come up with a vaccine. So where do we get eugenics? This is a brief description. Obviously, we could go on for pages, but some of the principal things to know. This is Francis Galton, Charles Darwin's cousin, and it was, pardon me, Galton who coined the phrase eugenics. It is a composite of the Greek words for good and born, and in the beginning, at least, I think it's fair to say that people of Galton's ilk and station were generally folks who were imbued with a 19th century sense of improvement, of almost unstoppable progress in many, many spheres. And his hope would have been to provide a way forward that would eliminate diseases and afflictions that could be interpreted as holding back the progress of humanity. However high-minded Galton's vision was, however high-minded his goals were, there were many, many more dark elements to eugenics than there were uplifting and salubrious. So here's a little more information on the eugenics, and what we will be focusing on primarily here is the second group, positive eugenics. I think Galton would have been a reasonable model of a person who advocated for positive eugenics. Negative eugenics, that is that's aimed to prevent those with physical, moral, mental challenges and to keep them from procreating, is more of what we're talking about. And what we're really talking about, if you put it into purely layman's terms, we're talking about sterilization and segregation of those people from the larger portion of humanity. In order to understand eugenics, you also have to understand the milieu in which it began to germinate and to prosper. You can see several items that are listed here, and many of them do hearken back to some of the social conditions that were afflicting the world at the turn of the 20th century. Along with some of the social and economic concerns, there was a really strong belief, progressive belief in scientific management and efficiency. As many of you may know, the late 19th, first few decades of the 20th century were known as a progressive era, and progressivism and eugenics in many ways shared many of the same characteristics. Many of the people who would be best known for their embrace of progressive measures to improve humanity and society were also those who were strong advocates for eugenics and control of populations. The quote you see here is from one of those people who we usually hold in fairly high regard, Oliver Wendell Holmes, who was a Supreme Court justice, author of the Buck v. Bell case, which is probably the most significant single case involving eugenics in American judicial history. We'll get into that a little bit later, but this is Holmes' famous quotes from that decision. And as it implies, the court found in favor of Bell, who was representing the state of Virginia. Buck was a female patient at a Virginia hospital. The case for sterilization was presented to a number of courts and finally ended up for her sterilization, before the Supreme Court, at which time her sterilization was upheld as legal and legitimate. And that decision still stands. It has never been overruled. So despite the fact that we're talking about 1927 and a lot has happened in terms of our awareness of individual rights and liberties, also some of the horrors that are oftentimes associated with the practice of eugenics in primarily Nazi Germany, that court case has never been overturned. It is still on the books. So what else was happening at the turn of the century that would have influenced the decision to begin what amounted to racial purification and the elimination of undesirables from the greater public? Well, one of those and this may resonate with some of you who remember comments having been made by contemporary politicians about having more immigrants from Norway than from other parts of the world. There was a similar sentiment during the first part of the 20th century. Now, up until roughly 1890, the composition of our immigrant populations was still weighted towards Northern Europe, Ireland, England, the Nordic countries, Germany. But after that, there was a decided shift in the national origin of many of the immigrants who were arriving in the United States. Eastern European in origin, sometimes members of religious minorities, particularly people from what was then part of what would then have been the Russian Empire, and also Southern Europeans, and I guess probably the typical candidate in that case would have been Italian. Well, this was decidedly different from the existing population of the United States, and that began to raise serious questions about their desirability, whether they could be assimilated into American culture. And there was a strong opinion that they could not. And I guess the apotheosis, if you will, of that particular strain of nativism was with the immigrant restrictions that took place in 1924, which were commonly known as the Johnson-Reed Act. And in essence, though that act said that that there would be quotas for immigrants that would be based on the 1890 census. And as that implied, those quotas would be weighted towards immigrant groups who were prevalent prior to that census. So again, weighted heavily towards people who, to those who composed this law and those who passed it, people who looked more like them than the other, than people who might not fit the national profile or would not fit the profile that they were hoping to achieve. So 1924, you can see that shift taking place. There was also, along with the growth of a immigrant population that was less likely to bear resemblance to the Native American native population, there was also a perceived rise in the number of undesirables who were coming to this country because they were bringing alien ideologies. And they mentioned a few in here: communism, socialism, and although we don't necessarily even consider this today, anarchists. Anarchists were a big concern. And the laws that were introduced were oftentimes designed specifically to weed out somebody who could be not only ethnically undesirable, but would also be fomenting these alien ideologies and performing terrorist acts in the United States. There were in the Wilson administration what is frequently referred to as the first Red Scare, where people in major American cities, primarily, who were considered to be unreliable, were rounded up and put on ships and sent back to Europe, including directly to Russia after the revolution. This is not to say that there were not terrorist acts, because it was also a time of considerable labor disputes. There were serious economic depressions, and there were also dislocations that were being caused by major attempts at union organization. You see, this is an example, but there are also some listed below that were infamous: the Homestead Steel Strike, the Pullman Strike, which was Eugene V. Debs' first big initiative, the Lawrence Textile Strike in 1912, and then the Bayonne and Patterson strikes. All of these included a fair amount of violence and were oftentimes associated with left-wing ideologues and anarchists, groups such as the industrial workers of the world, who were labeled leftists and communists. And as I said, it's not that there were not acts of violence, and probably the most noteworthy, although not always the best known, was the Wall Street explosion of 1920, which killed 30 people and wounded 143. It was this sort of incident, which has never been fully attributed to a particular group, although we think it was probably an anarchist cell associated with a group of Italian American anarchists who performed this. It's never been completely proven who did this. So all of this social ferment, all of these various strains on the fabric of American society, perceived, or in some cases, in actuality, were causing dislocation and a real sense that that regular people were finding that society was spinning out of control, and they had to control it somehow. They had to control, who was here, what they were doing, and this led to to a number of of different causes, one of them being a concerted effort to control what the homogeneity of the population. This is a quote from Charles Davenport. Connecticut, although it did not stand as one of the preeminent places in which the eugenics movement took root, it was amongst the earliest states to embrace eugenics legislation. Even in one case, prior to the general adoption of eugenics principles by medical science. Here's here's Charles Davenport again. The first eugenics law in the United States was introduced in Indiana. The second eugenics law in the United States was introduced in Connecticut in 1909. And it stipulated at first that the hospital for the insane at Norwich would be responsible for assessing and sterilizing prospective candidates who suffered from one of the drags, as Dr. Davenport put it, on American society. They could be mentally ill. They could be labeled as degenerates, and you can define degenerate as however you will. Quite crudely by our standards, they could be judged as morons and imbeciles. These are pretty broad topics and pretty broad characterizations, and it was not always medical science behind these labels. In some cases, it was simply a matter of defining the patient or the victim as such. Under the law, I should say that there were antecedents to that 1909 law too. In 1896, Connecticut became the first state to prohibit marriages between people who the state would define as imbeciles or mentally deficient. And anyone found violating that state law was subject to 3 years in prison. So even though we certainly were not producing sterilizations in the greatest numbers, we were amongst the earliest to begin to do so. This is a map from 1935, and you can see here the states that were either considering laws or those who had already embraced them. Connecticut would have been amongst those. You can see that those states have sort of a crosshatch or a diagonal line on them. There were far more states that were either considering them or had actually enacted them than there were states that demurred from that. I might add that despite our being early in promoting eugenics, Connecticut's overall record was on the low side. Now, all of the sterilizations that took place before 1920 took place at the Norwich State Hospital. Later, that was expanded to other state facilities in Connecticut. As time went on, the number rose and then began to drop off. Connecticut had its high point in terms of sterilizations in the 30s and early 40s. by the time that sterilizations or involuntary, I guess I should say involuntary sterilization ceased, which would have been 1963, we had sterilized approximately 577 individuals, most of them females. The majority of those were females who were prevented from procreating. However, to put this in proper perspective, that's 577 roughly between 1909, 1963. A state like California could do almost that many in a year. Which is, is frightening to think about. But as a small state, we were limited. There were only a few facilities. These, in some ways, it's amazing to think that this was still being practiced as late as 1963. But even, more astonishing, the sterilization laws, after several evolutions, were not taken off the Connecticut statutes until 1986. So that within the lifetime, I think, of most of us, of me at least, this was still a practice that was considered acceptable. So there's Dr. Davenport. Connecticut comes into this in many ways, both directly and somewhat more tangentially. Dr. Davenport was born in Stamford. Did not spend most of his adult life there, although I think he did have a summer place that he kept. He had an early interest in genetics, primarily plant genetics, and he began his career studying plants and small animals. He eventually began to branch out and began to hold summer classes that were supervised by the Brooklyn Polytechnic Institute on Long Island. He began doing those in the summer, and as his interest in genetics expanded, it began to expand into the realm of human genetics, and specifically eugenics, and how the human race could be improved. One of the things, there's a characteristic that several of these people seem to have in common. If you read biographical descriptions of Davenport, one of his main associate, Harry Laughlin, who we'll see in the next slide, they were all described as humorless. These were not lighthearted and jovial people. They were also passionate about their work. Davenport, for reasons I don't fully understand, was also he was not an easy character to get along with. He was people described him as highly insecure. Whether that was because he himself had some, had some misgivings about eugenics as a credible branch of science, I don't know. But he definitely had very strong racial views, and also very strong views on how people who we could say were not mainstream could be treated. And as he said quite here, this is one of his many glib quotes: "Two imbecile parents, whether related or not, have only one imbecile offspring." And that is a pretty good summary of the way that Davenport approached this. He was far less interested in therapeutics that might be brought to bear to help remedy these deficiencies than he was in simply cutting off the genetic material. And that was, by and large, through sterilization. So as his interest grew, he began to solicit contributions to help study human genetics with that, but always in the background, or subtly stated, the interest in purifying, in racial purity. And one of the people who first embraced his viewpoint and became curious and eventually enthusiastic about the prospects for improving society through eugenics was Mrs. E.H. Harriman. Not a common name today, but E.H. Harriman was one of America's wealthiest individuals. When he died, he left a tremendous amount of money to his wife, Mary Harriman. Some of you may, if that name resonates, the surname Harriman. Averell Harriman was one of America's foremost diplomats. That's his mother and father. So Mrs. Harriman became the first sponsor of Davenport's work. She provided what I guess we call today the seed money to begin the construction of facilities at Cold Spring Harbor that could help promote the amassing of information on racial, on deficiencies, on human deficiencies across the country, and also help provide the raw material necessary to make decisions about sterilization. Eventually, this would become a project funded by the Carnegie Institution of Washington, which is still a very active group, although I'm pleased to say no longer involved with eugenics. But beginning with their involvement every year, and you can still find these online if you're interested, you will find their annual, the Carnegie reports, and each year there would be a report from Dr. Davenport on the work being done by the Eugenics Record Office at the Biological Lab. The Eugenics Record Office was its principal focus, and it was from that office that the materials were gathered that ended up promoting sterilization. Let's see. Of course, like any good director, Davenport couldn't do it on his own. He needed a manager, and this was his manager, Harry Laughlin. We'll also revisit Mr. Laughlin a little bit later in this discussion. But right now, it's important to know that he was the man who was monitoring and directing the day-to-day activities of the Eugenics Record Office. The Records Office was not only a repository, it actively engaged in training people to go out throughout the country and gather information on what they would have considered deficient populations. They published a monthly bulletin, the Eugenics Record Office Bulletin, and it's a queer mixture of different types of information. There was one that would be reminiscent of the social pages, in which they would talk about the comings and goings of the students that they had trained, where they had taken up residency. They would provide information on the various reports, the numbers of reports on deficient populations that had been filed by these these peripatetic agents that they had trained. They would talk about some of the ongoing research that they were conducting. They did a number of profiles of individual families and groups who they thought were of particular interest because they were exemplars of this degeneracy that they found to be so dangerous. Here's just an example of, this is an example of the records office. Now these files are still extant. If you do go to the biological lab page, there is a whole section that is dedicated to describing in detail their the findings here. It says here they have 35,000 case histories, all sorts of stuff, all sorts of individual records on people and their and what it was that was challenging about them. What made them degenerate? Why were they? What could you find out about their particular maladies? Where did they come from? How are they linked to previous generations? And this was all very important because, however, specious some of the science was, they wanted to have enough information to back up the case for promoting eugenics as a means of population control. So 35,000 case histories, and these were being compiled by people like these. This is the eugenics training class of 1916. There's our friend Mr. Laughlin up there. He's all abeam because I guess this must be a particularly good class. And there is Dr. Davenport. Well, who were these people? Well, they came from a variety of backgrounds, but it was predominantly college educated women. What were they being taught? Well, these field workers, these interns, would be conducting genealogical information. They would be compiling genealogical information. They would be going into the field all over the country, really, to interview people and compiling data that would then be shipped to the biological lab for their record files, and then could be used as reference sources by states and by institutions who were advocating for or promoting eugenics and sterilization. When you look at the curriculum, it sounds rigorous. They were given charts to fill out. They were given instruction and how to put together detailed reports. However detailed the instruction was, however specific the lessons were on how to conduct these field investigations, most of the material that was compiled was completely anecdotal. It didn't have any real connection to science. So there were some of them that I've read. The reports would essentially be as told to. So they might have a particular family in mind. They would interview a neighbor who said, well, they scratch a lot. It's a well-known fact that the father, smokes and drinks and doesn't come home at all. Their grandfather was a dubious character. All sorts of information that would, in contemporary society, would be immediately dismissed as insufficient to perform something as life-altering as an operation to prevent procreation. But it was acceptable. Didn't mean that they didn't try to couch it in terms that would be compatible with scientific jargon, but the information just wasn't there. the law in Connecticut, like many of the laws, were not brought into fruition by people that you would judge to be out of the mainstream. This is the individual who authored the Connecticut law. He was a distinguished representative from Danbury. He was also considered to be a progressive. He was strongly affiliated with the movement for the vote for women, and in his eyes and the eyes of his contemporaries, because the law passed with overwhelming support, it was considered to be progressive legislation. This was going to help ensure that that society would be better, at least as they defined it. And this is John H. Light. There was some concern even then that the laws might be of dubious legality, but he dismissed it. He dismissed those inquiries and ruled that this was a police regulation. And so it was certainly within the power of the state, using their police authority to advocate for sterilization under the authorizing operations for the prevention of procreation. So the law stood. That did not mean that there were not people who would dissent from that, and they eventually would win out. But at least in the initial years, there were just as many people who were strong advocates. And one of those individuals who happened to be at the state hospital in Norwich during one of its most active periods was this gentleman, Henry Pollock. And as you can see here, in 1913, he reported on the numbers of people who were either going to be subject to sterilization or had been. It's kind of an interesting juxtaposition here. There was an equally prominent individual by the name of Henry Carmel, who served on the board for other institutions that were charged with performing these operations. As in this same report in 1913, that Pollock is talking about the success of the process at the state hospital. Carmel was also saying that at his facility, at his Connecticut, in this case, Connecticut State Prison, the results were really very different. That his group, who were making the decisions about sterilizations, had not been called on to render any decisions. And in fact, in the recent past, the only person who had even been considered for the operation was and I don't know if he said this tongue in cheek, was a convicted horse thief who was willing to subject himself voluntarily to the process because he thought it would give him a better chance of being released from prison early. So Carmel was looking at it, actually considered the law to be, almost unenforceable. Pollock, on the other hand, felt that the sterilization law would in fact have a very sunny future, and that did not turn out to be the case. Now, I mentioned that numbers of prominent people embraced, at least initially, eugenics as an acceptable scientific method. There were Woodrow Wilson, Winston Churchill, United States presidents, Theodore Roosevelt, Woodrow Wilson, all also were have made statements that were considered in which they lauded praise. Here's a couple that you may have never heard of, but have a very interesting, you might better know their daughter. Does anybody know who their daughter might be? Do we know a famous actress by the name of Hepburn? Julie? Yes, Katharine Hepburn's parents. These are her parents. Her father was the secretary. He was a founding member of the Connecticut Society of Social Hygiene and was their secretary through their existence. I wanted to give you a little taste of some of the things that they were doing. Oftentimes, a group like this started off and began by doing some things that we would really think of as progressive even today. They were strong advocates for education on the causes and results of venereal disease. They actually held clinics to help people get tested. They provided written materials in a number of languages. I'll just give you a sample of the kinds of things that they could do that would be of some benefit to society. This is taken from their minutes from November 24th of 1916. And in this report, they're talking about the number of clinics that they have held to promote information on the prevention of gonorrhea and syphilis. They've had their pamphlets on these topics translated into French, Italian, Hungarian, Polish, Greek, and Slovak. They're going to state facilities for the indigent and for children, and teaching them good social hygiene, how to avoid infections. However, and in the course of reporting on some of these trips, they make mention of southeastern Connecticut. So I thought I would just give you an example of the kind of thing that they were doing and the work that they were promoting. So this, this is November 24th, 1916, and the correspondent notes that my attention was called during the summer to the serious conditions in New London in regard to commercialized vice. An attempt has been made to interest a local physician who promised to interest himself in the matter. Institutionalized vice, in this case, was prostitution. But God forbid they would have used that term, but that's what they're talking about. The correspondent also goes on to say that I have not been able to get an interview with the health officer of Norwich, as he is away at the time when it is possible for me to go there, and there has not been an opportunity since. So they, proselytizing across the state, but certainly not leaving out of the mix southeastern Connecticut. So these can be seen as things that were truly of benefit to society, and that was the good time. That was the good stuff. However, they did not confine themselves to that. They began to also embrace other things that would not be considered nearly as nearly as progressive and as well-meaning to the population of Connecticut. And there is a brief quote here that they were promoting for themselves and this is in 1913, a committee on sterilization and defectives. They were promoting a board of examiners of feeble-minded criminals and other defectives, and it would be the duty of that board to examine into the mental and physical condition and record and family history so far available of the feeble-minded, including epileptics, criminal and other defective inmates confined in several state hospitals and reformatories, and to report in writing their findings to any judge in the Superior Court so that operations for the prevention of procreation can be performed upon those individuals. So we not only have the work that's being done via the Eugenics Record Office, we also have other groups independent of them who are engaged in parallel work. And I might add as well, at the same time that the society was promoting these sorts of investigations, the Eugenics Record Office was also sending interns to the Norwich State Hospital to do field work. They were also bringing the interns to the Norwich State Hospital for tours so that they could see the medical staff performing their rounds and interviewing their patients. I haven't read a report that indicates that they actually observed an operation, but you know, I guess if we were so inclined, we could speculate about that. The last thing you could probably call it the nadir of the eugenics movement in Connecticut occurred, pardon me, occurred later in the history of the movement in Connecticut, and that is sometimes associated with this gentleman. This is Wilbur Cross. I think many of you know who Wilbur Cross is. He's former governor of Connecticut. He is also has a turnpike named after him, and he is has a high school named after him as well. Cross was considered to be one of the governors, probably one of Connecticut's greatest governors, but he was also in office at a time when a major study was commissioned by the state to determine the best message for reducing the population of the city's state hospitals for or state insane asylums and related facilities. I think that Cross actually gets something of a bad rap. During the Depression, he was interested in ways in which alternatives could be found to care for patients who were mentally ill. He was not promoting eugenics, but because he was governor, he is sometimes tarred with the same brush as this gentleman. Frederick Collins Walcott, who was the Commissioner of Welfare in Connecticut. In 1937, he took a page from Wilbur Cross's interest in promoting alternative means for caring for people with mental illnesses, and decided that ought to include a statewide survey of what they euphemistically called the human resources of Connecticut. And the committee that Walcott headed up chose Harry Laughlin to perform that function. He did. Laughlin and his associates studied most of the 162 towns in Connecticut. They also did dozens of studies on individuals and came up with a plan, if it had been adopted, which it was not, that would have effectively eliminated through sterilization maybe a third of the population. It was absolutely incredible. It was even too much for people who found eugenics an acceptable practice. Even some of the folks who I think would be inclined to embrace extreme methods found this wanting. And the report itself was never adopted by the state. It also was never reproduced en masse for distribution. The only copy I know of the report is a copy that resides in the law library at Yale University. I have not seen it. I have not seen it myself, but perhaps when it becomes easier to visit archives of that sort, I will be able to do so. The ending for all of this was none too pleasant. As you probably can guess, as the 30s went on, it became clear that eugenics was being wholesalely embraced by groups who were bound and determined to use it to absolutely eliminate racial minorities. In the best case is Nazi Germany. Both Harry Laughlin and Davenport were impressed by what the Germans were doing. From his writings, it was clear that Laughlin was certainly smitten with the Nazi practices. In fact, they adopted his work as their own. The genesis for the racial laws that were enacted in Hitlerite Germany were, in fact, had their antecedents in the work of Laughlin and Davenport. And if that wasn't bad enough, in 1936, the University of Heidelberg offered Laughlin an honorary doctorate, which he was more than happy to accept. The irony of it is that shortly thereafter, he was diagnosed with epilepsy and had several epileptic fits. Epilepsy is one of the maladies that would have made him a prime candidate for sterilization. As a result of what was done in Germany, as a result of growing opposition, a lot of it based in the Catholic Church, who strongly opposed eugenics regulation. They were in the forefront of the anti-eugenics movement, anti-sterilization movement in Connecticut. These laws, by and large, have atrophied, with the exception of a law that has not been tested again since the 20s, Buck v. Bell. Most states, if not all, have dropped their sterilization laws. So today, sterilization, at least in this guise, is a dead letter. Hopefully, that will remain so. But it certainly has a long and sordid history, and unfortunately, there were parts of that were on prominent display in Connecticut. So that's what I have to say, and I think I've gone on for more than an hour. It's probably more than you wanted to know, but I thought that I hope that it was of some interest to you. There's a lot more work to be done. There are records I have not been able to access, especially the ones at Cold Spring Harbor, the ones that are in Hartford that relate to the social hygiene group that the Hepburn family was involved in. These, because of the pandemic, I haven't had a chance to go and review them, but I do hope so, and I hope that this has been of some interest to you. I think it was better than a stick in the eye. Does anyone have?
It was very interesting, Bob.
Yeah, it is. I mean, it's as I said, there's a lot more to be done, and there are so many more people that you could point to. There were many more examples that I could get into, but trying to fit it into an hour and a few pages is unfortunately not always possible. But anyway, if any of you are still awake and have questions, I'd be more than happy to try and address them. And thank you for your attention.
Feel free to put them in the chat, or you can unmute yourself if you'd like to ask Bob personally any of these questions. I know that for years now I've been telling Bob that there's a book here that I think that this would make an interesting book. So
yeah, there are some very good books that are available to the public if you'd like to get more of an overview. And I'll only mention one primarily because I've got it sitting here right next to me, which is by a fellow by the name of Paul Lombardo, Lombardo. The book is entitled 3 Generations, No Imbeciles. And Lombardo has written widely on the subject. I'd say that he also has a good bibliography that you can draw on, and points to some of the archival resources that are also available online. I did mention a couple of those. If you'd like to look further, there are copies at the Carnegie Institute in Washington. There are copies of a number of the reports from Cold Spring Harbor that you can read online, and they do make for interesting reading. Anybody? I guess not.
Yeah.
Bob.
Oh, Linda, did you have a question?
Or,
Yeah. No, I just said thank you for your time.
Oh.
my time is your time. Happy to. All right.
Wendy, did you have a question?
Can you share the PowerPoint presentation, please?
Yeah, I think we could do that. Can we, Julie?
Well, we can. We're going to be putting this up on our YouTube page. We have been recording the main part of this. None of your pictures will be in it, but the PowerPoint will be on our YouTube page. But Wendy, I have your email address. I can send it to you if you'd like. I can get it from Bob tomorrow and forward it to you. And you all have my email. You who registered, you have my email address at adult programs at Otis Library in Norwich. Yeah, and you can just go ahead and if you'd like a copy of this also, just email me and I'll forward it on to you.
Thank you so much.
Yeah.
You're welcome.
Yeah, Yeah, and if any of you do have follow-up, questions, you're more than happy. I'm more than happy to read your emails, receive them, and give you any updates that I have. I do have some more notes and things that I'd be happy to share, and some bibliographic material that might help you as well.
Bob, can you hear me?
I can.
Oh, good. Yeah, I was trying to get through. I was on my phone. Do you have time for another question?
Sure.
Okay, great. So since my understanding that Norwich Hospital was always basically run or administered with psychiatry, the place of psychiatry in Norwich Hospital, both before 1963 with all this sterilization eugenics stuff, and then after, can you make any comment on the relationship or where the eugenics movement and interest played into psychiatry at Norwich or elsewhere?
I wish I could, but to be honest, I don't have any information that would be able to answer that question effectively.
Okay.
But it's interesting. Not very many of these people were associated with psychiatry or psychology.
Uh-huh.
Their antecedents were oftentimes in biology. I'm trying to think. Pollock, for example, was primarily interested in homeopathic medicine.
Uh-huh.
And after he left Norwich, he went to an institute that was primarily engaged in medical research under that subject heading.
I see.
Yeah. Harry Laughlin, a guy like him, I eventually had to, if you will, he had to go back to school to get some sort of credential that would put him it would give him a sense of authority when he was doing this work and managing the eugenics record office, because that again was not his background. And as time went on and people began to question some of the basis for eugenics, he began to lose a lot of his credibility, and actually he was eased out of Cold Spring Harbor before the eugenics record office closed in 1939. So even by that point, there were serious questions about whether or not this was science or pseudoscience.
Uh-huh. Yeah. Well, thank you very much.
Sure. Yeah. As I said, I'm happy to share this information. I think there are probably several books, Julie. I would just focus on Connecticut. I think there's enough there for at least monitor. And if I've misspoken myself in the course of any of this, forgive me. Sometimes it's hard to do it from memory, but I do think that you'll find once you get in, you do a little bit of research, it'll be a fascinating topic for you.
Well, thank you so much, Bob, and thank you everyone for joining us this evening. Like I said, you have my email address if you'd like to reach out if you have any further questions, or if you would like me to email you a copy of this PowerPoint. So thank you, and I hope all of you have a good evening.
Thank you very much.
Thanks very much.
Thank you.
Good to have you here.
Yep.
Take care.